Well, hello and welcome back to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast committed to the craft, the call, and the content of the Black preaching tradition. I got a great guest with me this go round. It's Dr. Bobby Manning. If you haven't heard from this brother, it's going to be a treat in this episode. So look forward to having a conversation with Dr. Manning.
Welcome to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to the calling, craft, and content of the Black preaching tradition. And now, here's your host, John C. Richards Jr.
The good doctor, Bobby Manning. What's up, man? How you doing?
What's up, bro? Thank you so much for having me on, man. Excited.
Yeah, no problem at all, man. No problem at all. So Dr. Manning, you are the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of District Heights, also affectionately known as the Heights, right? And
Mm-hmm.
have an interesting background. You went to Campbell for undergrad and got a BA in religion,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went and got a master in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and then got a DMin from Regent
Mm-hmm.
University. You've written 4
Yeah.
books, husband of one wife, and then also have 3 boys. So you got Reuben,
Yeah.
you got the second one is
Uh-huh.
Levi, is that right?
Uh-huh.
And then your third is Joseph.
Yep. So the other way around.
Okay,
So Levi's the
okay,
first. Levi's my oldest. He's 15. Ruben is my middle son. He is 13. He's almost
hmm
13. And then Joseph, is my baby boy. He's 10.
okay. Now I gotta ask you the obvious question: were y'all shooting for 12?
My wife gets asked that question often, and she says, "Well, it took multiple women to get those 12 tribes." And so,
That's a good answer. Your wife is a wise woman.
no, we, yeah, she know the word. So nah, we started with Levi. We loved the name Levi,
Mm,
and then once we got there, it just kind of like, well, why don't we stick with the tribes and see how it
mm.
goes. And then of course the names just fit for our sons, and it just but three's
That's
enough. We it's 3 Manning
hey.
tribes. It's 12 tribes of Israel, but it's only 3 Manning tribes.
That's dope, man. That is dope. Hey, let's talk a little bit about your call to ministry. Some people do know who you are, and apparently you were called to ministry very young. I think you may have had 16 in your bio.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to know about that.
Yeah.
How did that come about? Was it one of those like I'm getting drug kicking and screaming calls, or just kind of this clarion call that God had called you from an early age?
Man, I think it was more of the latter. I think the kicking and screaming part was just kind of me trying to figure it out and figure out what that meant to be young and in ministry and what I can and can't do, you know what I'm saying, because of the call that's on my life and walking in the call at a young age. And so I grew up in church. And so I often make the joke that I was born on a Saturday and mama couldn't take me to church that Sunday, but the next Sunday I was in church. So I grew up in church, in church, in Sunday school, learning the Bible, etc. And by the time I got to be a teenager, I recognized that I knew some Bible. I understood the scriptures in ways that my peers did not.
Mm,
And I could explain it. I just had this gift of explaining the Bible, and I had this passion that my peers, my classmates, my friends would understand the Bible. And so, right around the time that I'm 15, 16, I'm walking with Jesus. I love basketball, and so I have hoop dreams from the time that I'm a kid, and so I'm realizing that for me it was basketball or nothing until I realized that I wasn't as good as I thought I was. Every level you go up in sports, you realize that even if you were the best at the last level, everybody that you're playing at this level, it was the best at the last
mm,
level. And so it was right around the time I was 16 that I realized that I probably wasn't going to the NBA. I wasn't tall enough. I wasn't fast enough, and and that's also the time that God was getting a hold of me, and really building this passion in me to explain the word, building a passion in me to lead and shepherd and help people to know Jesus even at a young age. And so by the time I was 16, it was pretty clear, and from the time I was a kid, whether it was basketball or anything else, I would jump into what I was doing with both feet. And
Mm,
so when God called me, I said, all right, let's
mm.
go. And it was full steam ahead from there.
Wow. Who was the most shocked or surprised that you were called to ministry, or was anybody?
I don't know if anybody was shocked or surprised for me at that time to tell them that I was called to ministry. My mom was probably the most pleased, uh, but as far as shocked or
Mm,
surprised, I don't know if anybody was shocked or
mm,
surprised. Just it was leaning in that direction anyway for a few years prior to me just kind
mm,
of jumping into the
mm.
call.
So let's talk about how you fleshed out that call, because some people want to know, well, how does this man get connected to the Godfather of the Black church? You know who I'm talking about? John K.
Who you
Jenkins.
talking about? I don't know who
John
you talking
K.
about.
Jenkins.
Yes, sir. Yes,
So
sir.
how is it that you got connected
So I grew
there?
Yeah, I grew up in church. Around the time I was 10 or 11, my dad started attending First Baptist Church of Glenard. And so, I would go, I was, some Sundays with my mom to her church and some Sundays to First Baptist with my dad. And and then Pastor Jenkins moved into my neighborhood. And so one day we're out shooting ball playing, and Pastor Jenkins' daughter Sarah, who is now head basketball coach at the at University of Delaware, she and her brother Josh riding bikes around the neighborhood. We start playing and hanging out. And the rest is just kind of history. We become very good
Mm,
friends. I'm hanging out in Pastor Jenkins' driveway, playing ball or kicking it with his kids, and then so he gets to know who I am and I get to know who he is, and then he realizes that I'm that young kid that goes to his church and is super involved in youth ministry. And so when I'm called to ministry, he of course is one of the first people that I tell, and immediately he begins encouraging my gift, pouring into my gift. And so when I went off to college, he was aware. When I went to seminary, he supported me. First Baptist supported me in seminary, and then when I got out of seminary, I got a call when I was about to graduate. I got a call from my pastor, Pastor Jenkins, and he said, "Bobby, what are you going to do when you graduate?" And I said, "Pastor, what am I going to do when I graduate?" And he said, "Do you want to come home?" And I said, "I want to come home." And he brought me back on staff
mm,
at First Baptist. And so yeah, I've known Pastor Jenkins. I'm for 30 years of my life, 30 plus years of my life,
mm.
and he's been my pastor, my father in the ministry from that time. Yeah,
Wow, that's just so amazing how providential God is to have Pastor Jenkins to be your neighbor
absolutely.
and actually be able to pour in you
Yeah,
that
yeah,
way. And then also that shared love of basketball with you and his daughter. Just seems like God was at work in
hmm
all of that, in all of that. Let's talk about your
yeah,
D-min,
yeah.
because you went on and got a D-min.
Mhm.
How has your work in the D-min program informed your call? And then I got another question for you, because a D-min from Regent, it seems like you might have to put some seasoning and some salt on that one so you can make sure you contextualize it for your people.
Well, a couple of those. So to your first question, um, uh, my remind me the first question because you
Right, I got you.
you
I
may be
got you.
laughing at the
So
second question. Remind me the
The
first question.
D-min, how does that inform your call to
Yes.
pastoral ministry? Yeah.
Oh, of course. Of course. So I actually started my D men a few months before I became pastor at the Heights. And so I was still on staff at First Baptist. It was a young adult pastor and Pastor Jenkins' assistant. And I was, I wanted to go ahead and get started with my Doctor of Ministry degree. And it was at the beginning of that season that God called me to District Heights. And so as I'm developing my project and going to my classes, etc., and shooting towards what I would write about, I, I my dissertation topic was effectively engaging young men of color, or specifically young Black men, aged 20 to 29, and so my dissertation work, my dissertation research, went hand in hand with me building the men's ministry at the Heights. And so I was, at the same time I was researching and reading and interviewing and doing all of the qualitative and quantitative research for my doctoral
Mm.
dissertation. I'm building a men's ministry that didn't exist prior at this church. And so how I engage men, how we do men's ministry, the elements that we try to sew into men's ministry were all results of the work I did in my D-Min project while I was working on my doctorate. And so completed the dissertation and then converted it actually to my first book. My first book is called Saving Our Sons, Effectively Engaging Young Men of Color. And
Mm.
so Saving Our Sons is basically my doctoral dissertation. My editor and I worked hard to expand it so it's not just Black men, it's men of color. And it's not just concentrated into this geographic region, but that it hits all geographic regions. But yeah, that was the work. And what I love about D-Min work, and it speaks to your second question, is that it's self-directed, and what you can do is apply it immediately. Everything that I was doing in D-Min studies, I was applying immediately, like in class Tuesday, applying it Saturday,
Mm.
like
Mm.
doing work and research on Thursday and applying it Sunday. It was real time scholastic growth that affected my practical ministry in real
Mm.
time. And so maybe one day PhD is in my future, but I'm glad that I went the D-Min route for that exact reason, because it was directly applicable and I needed that as a brand new pastor. I needed to be able to allow what I was doing to have
Mm.
legs, and it certainly did. When it comes to Regent, the wonderful thing about, again, doctoral ministry and obviously doctoral research is that it is really self-directed, and so I could read what I wanted to read. I could study what I wanted to study. I introduced authors into my research that I wanted to introduce. If you pull my dissertation, in my bibliography, I got everybody from Tony Evans to Jawanza Kunjufu to Tupac.
Mm.
Like these are the references in my dissertation. And so maybe really it's more. I would say that hurdle that you're describing probably applies more to Dallas Seminary
Mm.
than it did to Regent, more to my master's work than to my
Mm.
doctorate work, again, because your doctorate work is very self-directed. And then the chair of my dissertation committee is Dr. Antipas Harris, a man of color. My dissertation committee, Dr. Johnny Parker was on that dissertation committee along with Dr. James Flynn. And so culture wasn't an issue at all in doctoral work.
Mm.
We can certainly though have that conversation when it
The
comes to
master's
master's
level.
work and undergraduate bachelor's work.
Yeah,
hmm
yeah, yeah. That's good, man.
Yes, because at the master's level, you're doing a lot more eating from the table, right? You're there at master's level. They're telling you what to read, and they're giving you directed assignments. And if there's something else you want to add, you have to have a specialized class, or you got to do it in your own time. And so culturally, that was a little more of a hurdle probably on the bachelor's level and the master's level than it was on the doctorate level.
Yeah. So I appreciate the fact that you were able to work through some of the programming at your church as you went through your D-Min. And there's some people who may be watching who are in the middle of a D-Min program and like, man, I just have time to finish my
Mhm.
stuff. and they don't necessarily take advantage of doing that
Hmm.
parallel work. How might you encourage them to do that, and why that's a necessity for them in ministry, especially for a D-men program?
Yes, just so you don't kill yourself. It's vital, and when it's easy to do when you're a senior pastor, obviously, because when you're if you're a staff pastor, you have to your work day has so much to do with what your supervisors say your work day is, and the things that you're jumping into is controlled obviously by your senior pastor, your directors, or your supervisors. For me, because I was a senior pastor, I could say, you know what, for these next 18 months,
Mm,
my thing beyond preaching and serving the people is men's ministry. And that's what I was able to do. Now, not all while I was in class time, not all of my classes are about men's ministry. And I mean, my D-Men program is in community transformation. And so you're exegeting your community, you're exegeting yourself, you're going through all of and so what I'm learning, what I'm reading, I'm turning around and I'm teaching. That's something Howard Hendricks said early at Dallas Seminary. Howard Hendricks said the best way to learn something is to teach it to somebody else.
mm,
And so whatever I was learning in my doctoral program, that was what I was teaching in Bible study. That's what I was teaching on Sundays. In some manner, with some way, shape, or form, I was gonna get every ounce of juice out of this squeeze.
mm.
It's going to work everywhere I am, and that's just. I mean, it was just prudent, and it turned out to be a prudent way to approach doctorate work. So if you can, I absolutely recommend it.
Yeah, that's good. Man, we've talked about your call to ministry. After the break, we're going to talk about the craft of your preaching. I've enjoyed you from afar in terms of the craft of your preaching, so I want to talk with you about your craft.
Scholars have referred to the original black church as the invisible institution because enslaved people were often not allowed to worship freely. They'd have to gather, sing, and preach in secret to avoid being beaten. Yet they still developed a deep devotion to the authority of Scripture and the liberation narrative. Today, many Christians who don't fully agree with conservatives or progressives feel invisible. They're not well represented in politics or mainstream media. In response, the AND campaign has created the Invisible Institution newsletter, or IVI. We'll be providing political commentary, policy breakdowns, and more for Christians who believe in social justice and moral order, not one or the other. Go to andcampaign.org and subscribe if you're sick and tired of feeling invisible.
All right, Dr. Manning, we're going to talk about the craft of your preaching. You're a gifted storyteller. I've seen you do some illustrations that have been just great and profound and have impacted the audience. I want to ask you about your process and then start by asking you, what's your favorite part of the sermon preparation process?
Mm. My favorite part of the sermon. Can I say all of it? I guess I can't say all of it, can I? Um, my favorite part of the process, I guess, would have to be that time between the where you have your outline and your content and and the time where you just get to be creative. That's my favorite point,
Mm,
where okay, I've done the exegesis, I've done my text mapping, I've done my work, the structure is there, I know what the flow of the passage is, and I tell my students the flow of the passage will 9 times out of 10 be the flow of your sermon.
mm,
Once I have that down, and the foundation, the pillars are there, that's when I get to be creative. And you mentioned illustrations. I love illustrations. The preaching that I loved growing up, whether was the preaching that had incredible illustrations. And so my favorite preachers are Jeffrey Johnson out of Indianapolis, and of course Dr. Tony Evans out of Dallas, and others who do great at capturing stories. Charlie Dates is another who are just incredible at capturing stories, telling stories. But then also some of my favorite preachers aren't preachers; they're comedians, right? And so I love the storytelling of some of the best comedians, because a great illustration hits when people don't realize it's an illustration
Mm,
until it hit.
mm, yeah.
And that's the exact definition of a punchline in comedy. And so the creative portion that comes after that right after the exegesis and the pulling of the truth out of the passage and structuring it all, which I also love. But and one of the laments of my preparation is that I don't get to spend enough time doing that.
Mm.
I I spend so much time, obviously, because we have to, in exegesis and structuring out the message. It ends up being only a few hours that I get to just sit and dream.
Mm.
I get to think through telling this story. And sometimes, some of my best illustrations I came up with in the car on the way to church. And I don't say that as a badge of honor. I say that like, man, if I had thought about this Thursday, it
It
would
could have
be even
marinated
better.
real good.
It could have marinated. Yeah, yeah.
Mm, mm,
And so yeah, it didn't get to sit in the crock pot long enough.
mm.
And so yeah, that's the answer. Is that creative portion is probably my favorite.
Yeah. So in that process, when you get to that creative portion and you think through illustrations and you think about black preaching, and I heard you talk about comedy.
Hmm.
We've had, or as we're recording this, we've had the Cat Williams movement a couple of weeks ago. And so I
Hmm.
heard it said
Yeah.
that Jesus himself had a bit, that he also had
Mm.
a sermon that he preached over and over again, Sermon on the Mount, and that he was testing out quote unquote
Hmm.
material in that way, saying, okay, here's what's hitting the audience. So I think that, to your point, I think that we
Hmm.
as pastors can learn a lot from comedians, because a lot of pastors they
Absolutely.
pursue platforms, but these comedians start in these smaller environments. Man, preach you a sermon in a smaller
Hmm.
at a nursing home. Preach you a sermon somewhere smaller. Test
Absolutely.
out your material. And so I think
Hmm.
that goes a long way in
Absolutely.
saying that comedians can help us in our craft as well. In our craft as well.
Sure. Yeah. And some of the best sermons you've heard are sermons that have been preached 15 times. If you and I, for instance, will go to the E.K. Bailey Expository Preaching Conference, and we'll hear an amazing sermon, and we know, and we know that sermon was great. It was impactful. What we don't know is that sermon has been tested and
Mhm.
tweaked and changed. And we move this illustration up, move this truth down, and
Mm.
it's the 15th time. And it's the same is true of our comedians. When by the time you see X comedian's Netflix special, they've done that hour's worth of material 100
Yeah. Yeah.
times at least.
Mm. Mm.
And so it's okay for that to be true, which is why, even if you preach every Sunday like I do, the best presentation of my sermon is the sermon that I've preached in the mirror
Mm.
at least 5 times
Yep.
before I stand before God's people. And if I'm faithful to get my work done early, and some weeks allow me to and some weeks don't, but if I'm faithful to get my work done early so that I can do that, the better the presentation aspect. There are two aspects of sermon of sermon delivery, right? There's the preparation, and then there's the presentation. I teach an expository preaching class, and my class is the science of expository preaching. We spend a great deal of amount of time in the curating and the crafting of the message. But one of the things I have to tell my students often is don't spend so much time in preparation that you're preparing the sermon all the way up until the time that you preach it, and you've never practiced the presentation,
Mm.
because it sounds so much better in your head than it does coming out of your mouth. And the worst time to figure that out is in front of the people.
That's right.
And so you want to be able to spend that time in preparation and be faithful and consistent with that. But you need to spend the time preparing to present as well, so that because you'll say it in your head and it sounds so good in your head, but then by the time it gets from your head to your mouth, like that didn't
That ain't hit like it
that
was
didn't
supposed to.
come across the way I thought it would. That didn't hit like it was supposed to.
Mm.
And so you can have a great sermon on paper, but nobody in that church, in that congregation, is reading your sermon, reading your manuscript or your outline.
Mm.
You also the great sermon on paper has got to be a great sermon in presentation as well.
That's good. So I'm interrupting you in the middle of your exegetical process. I'm busting into your study in your office.
Mhm.
What's open
Uh-huh.
on your desk? What books, what resources are
Ooh,
open
that's
on your
good.
desk?
That's good. If you bust into my office early in the week, what you find is me standing over what I call a text map. Um, a text map is a document that I create. I take the text of the scripture. I take it out of the Bible, put it on paper, and then I map it out, where visually you see the flow of the passage. I would have to show it to you in order to. I could show it to you better than I could explain it to you, but it shows the flow of the passage. Every clause is indented under the clause that it modifies, and so when you see it that way, what it does is it helps you find the flow of the passage. And then once I find that flow and I have that, and I used to print it out and scribble on it. Now technology allows me to put it in my iPad, so I can take my iPad everywhere. And what you'll find, if I handed you my iPad, you'll find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of text maps that I've scribbled on. So when I'm doing my study, whenever I get something, whether it's a word study or culture or background or truth that is there in that passage, cross reference to another passage, whatever the case may be, I scribble it right there on that sheet of paper,
Mm.
so that as I'm marinating in that text, everything that I've studied is right there on that sheet of paper.
Mm.
The flow of the passage, the word studies, the exegesis of the passage, front and back. If in the middle of my preparation, an illustration comes to me, I turn it on the back of the page. I write the illustration down. I come back because I don't want to force an illustration onto a text or into a sermon that doesn't work just because it'll sound good. And then and so to answer your question, I got that open and I got Logos open. So Logos Bible software is my go-to. I never close down Logos. It's open on my computer right now, and because that's word studies are right there. My favorite commentaries right there. Backgrounds are right there, and the cross references are all right there, and so it just makes it easy, and it's on my laptop. So wherever I go, I can pull out my text map and Logos, and I can study anywhere. If
Mm.
I'm taking my car for an oil change and I'm stuck at the dealership, I can pull out my text map and my Logos, and I can get it in.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so you say you bust into my office, you might not find me because because I'm somewhere.
On the
I'm
go.
hustling, I'm running, but I'm able on the go, because I'm an extrovert, so too much time in the office is
Mm.
going to drive me crazy anyway.
That's good, man. Listen, I'm a Logos evangelist myself. I use it all the time and I always commend it to
Hmm.
pastors. Even the pastors are
Hmm.
like, I just got to have my books open on my desk. I'm like, you're working too hard, bro. You're working too hard.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, I'm just trying to,
Whatever works for you,
yeah,
and if it's cool, if that's what works for you, it's cool.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm not that guy.
Mm.
If there's a tool that allow me to click something and open every book I got on that process, on that passage,
That's it.
that's what we're gonna
That's it. That's it. Hey, so how did you get from scribbles to sermon?
do. So remember I told you, so the text map is going to show me the flow of the
Hmm.
passage. The flow of the passage 9 times out of 10 is going to be the flow of the sermon. Yeah, as this, I tell my students, as the scripture moves, your sermon
Mm.
moves. And there are exceptions to that rule. Joel Gregory shows a few exceptions to that rule, which I appreciate. But again, 9 times out of 10, that's how it flows for me. And so while I'm studying, I'm finding the flow. Once I find the flow, and once I'm able to kind of express first what my proposition is, what is the one thing I'm saying? Now I'm saying, what is the one thing this passage is saying? Which means it's the one thing that this sermon's going to say. And then I find what the movements of the text that support that proposition are. That's another thing I'm writing on the back of the text map. Once I have that, and I feel like, okay, I've done a reasonable and a faithful job of my exegesis, I can transfer what I have on that page over to my sermon. And here's how: I start with my points, and they're there because the movements are there. And so, and that's when the beginning of the creative process. How am I gonna say this proposition? How am I going to say these points? And once I have that, because I've been in that text for hours and hours and hours, once I have that outline, that's when I start pulling all those scribbles over into the sermon in an organized manner. Everything flows and everything's organized because it was organized over here. I began the process making sure this is organized by mapping out this text. Once I've mapped out the text, the organization is there. So I know when it comes time to write the sermon, to outline the sermon, I should say, I know exactly where everything goes. Because it's organized from the very beginning. One of the things that I do, I do this leadership toolkit that's available online, and I take my text maps and I just drop them in there. So people who subscribe to the toolkit just get text maps, and so preachers who are just looking for a place to start, there's a sermon starter. They go in and grab one of these text maps because again, if you start there, you start with organization. It makes it easier to go from study to sermon.
Yeah, and we'll grab that link from you because I know that preachers on this podcast love resources.
Yes.
We love giving away resources, and if you're giving it away for the free, they will line up and grab it. So we appreciate you for that. One more question on the craft: how do you get illustrations, retain illustrations, and then kind of apply them to text in their context?
That's good. That's such a good question. I think it begins with looking for illustrations everywhere, all the time. I used to tell folks, because this is what I would do. And I'm dating myself a little bit. I would walk out of the house every day with an index card, a blank index card, and just put it in my pocket. And every time I reached in my pocket, I would fill that index card. And the index card was a reminder to me that I need to be looking for an illustration. And because illustrations are everywhere. Illustrations are in your car while you're driving. Illustrations are in the garden. Illustrations are on television and the movie that you're watching. Illustrations are everywhere. And so my prompt would be to find an illustration, even if it was a bad one, and write it on that index card and put it in the box, in the illustration box. Now I use my phone, my iPhone. I use the note section of my iPhone. And my goal is every day, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a goal. Every day I try to find an illustration and I write it in the note section of my phone. What that does is it exercises your illustration muscle. Because the truth is, and I thought this would be true, John, that I would, whenever I'm in a sermon, I would just go back to my illustration database because I got thousands of them in there and pull one from there. Hardly ever happens.
Nope.
What ends up happening is the point lives with me. And so and then the creative muscle gets activated. And the illustrations come not because I pulled it from a database. The illustrations come because I've exercised the illustration muscle. In what way can I drive this point home? Oh, this is what happened with my son Ruben this week. Or, oh, this is what happened while I was driving recently. And then, preachers, the story gets embellished a little bit because you want it to drive home a little bit better, and the way it actually happened doesn't drive it home.
Right.
But
Look,
we
little
tweak.
extra on it. Little extra.
Hey y'all, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, y'all. I know y'all think that all the preacher stories and the illustrations are true. They are based on a true story.
That should be the disclaimer every time.
Right. It's based on a true story.
Wow.
and,
Wow.
so,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, that's for me. It's always, as much as I can, be exercising the illustration muscle,
Mm.
because you got it. And remember that you are a unique person.
Yeah.
So for me, I study comedians because I like to think I'm kind of funny, right?
Mm.
And so I'm not a good enough comedian to be a comedian, but I'm a good enough comedian to add some funny stuff into my sermons,
Mm.
right? That's me. You may not be funny. If you're not funny, don't try to
Don't
be
do
funny.
it. Don't do it.
If you're a if you're a gardener,
Mm.
use gardening illustrations. If you're a historian, use illustrations from histories and
Mm.
biographies. If you are if you love sports, use illustrations from sports, and don't apologize for using illustrations from sports if that's what's going to drive the point home. Whatever you are,
Yeah.
and however God has shaped you, it's okay to use that as a tool in your preaching. The best thing, the greatest way you can honor God
Mm.
is by being yourself as a preacher.
That's good, man. That's good. Yeah, I've learned that the best illustrations don't come from a database, but do come from your life. And I've
Mhm.
just seen that over
Absolutely.
and over again. So that just confirms that. And y'all make sure y'all follow Dr. Manning's advice and start writing those things down because we lose them, especially the older we get,
Absolutely.
and we get mad when
Oh,
we lose
and,
those jokers too.
and that's why I kept it. Oh, it's so mad. It's so mad. Yeah, because you'll say, "Oh, I'm gonna remember that," and then 15 minutes later, you're like, "What was that
Gone.
illustration? It was good too." And so, yeah, write it down immediately.
Yeah, yeah. That's great, man. So we talked about your call, we talked about your craft. On the other side, we're going to talk about the content and the context of your preaching. You're in a unique context there in DC. We want to talk about that. What's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I hope this interview has been a blessing so far. If you want more content and resources around Preaching While Black, go over to our YouTube channel, Preaching While Black. We have all the episodes from our interviews up, but we also have other resources for you as a Black preacher as you try to hone your craft, your call, and your content for Black preaching. Now back to our episode. All right, Dr. Manning, DC. So I got to tell you a story about DC
Yeah.
real quick. All right, I went to law school in DC between
Hmm.
2001 2004. Uh, Worst 3 years of my life. I apologize to all the DC heads, but I'm gonna tell you why. Okay, 9/11, sniper, and winter storm, and that just blew
Oh
me
wow.
away. Those 3 years, it
Yeah.
was like, whoa, my goodness. But
Yeah.
God was faithful. God was a keeper in the midst of that. But I said, I am getting out of DC on the first thing smoking, not because the city wasn't great, just because there was so much going on in those 3 years. Now, there's a lot going
Sure.
on today
Sure.
in DC, these days in DC.
Hmm.
And as a
Hmm.
preacher, you cannot ignore that and ignore that context in your preaching. So I want to take you back to January 6th and the next Sunday
Hmm.
after January 6th as an expository preaching expositor. How do you handle
Yeah.
that in DC, or how did you handle that in DC after that moment?
Yeah. So first, let me say, the reason why you wanted to get out of DC is you did not eat enough mumbo sauce. You need to come back and get some mumbo sauce, and it will grow your love for DC,
I got you.
and you'll want to come back. Uh, January 6th, as a pastor, and you must realize that stuff hit home, like close to home. I mean, that's up the street. There are members of our church who are Capitol Police.
Mm,
Actually, there was one of my ministerial staff who is Capitol Police. He got called out that day, meaning he was supposed to be at the Capitol downtown on
wow.
that day, and they called him out. Now, there are many reasons why that is, and it's his story to tell. But it was a tough one. When you deal with those types of issues, as a senior pastor, you have to make a decision, and each instance is unique. You Am I going to change the worship experience? Am I going to change my sermon? Am I going to address this from the pulpit and then continue into what I had planned? What I found, John, and this is a beautiful thing about our sovereign God, is I plan my preaching. I say a year in advance. Usually it's 9 months more accurately, 9 to 10 months more accurately. What I found in planning my preaching ahead so often is that even though I don't know what's going to happen next January, God does.
Yep.
And so on that particular occasion, I didn't have to change my sermon because my sermon addressed the fear, the disappointment, the frustration of the turning tides of the world.
Wow.
And so I really could just lean into my sermon, lean into the text because I didn't have to change it.
Mm.
If it didn't, I probably would feel the need to change it somehow, or just okay. We're not doing a regular sermon this Sunday. We need to pray. And so what ended up happening that Sunday was okay. We spent extended time in prayer, and we pray for our nation, and we pray for those who were affected downtown. We pray for those who we know who were affected downtown. And then we go into the passage and we preach. We preach Jesus, because you can never go wrong with preaching Jesus,
Mm.
right? You can never go wrong with the gospel. The gospel is like aspirin. However you take it, it goes to where you need it.
Mm.
And so what I remember about that Sunday is I did not have to change my sermon because God had already prepared a message that. And a text that would apply.
Mm. This is why I always encourage brothers and sisters to do a preaching calendar, because God is just as providential
Mhm.
in your preaching calendar as he would be if you were doing preaching week to week. I remember we did the Gospel of Mark one
Absolutely.
year in our church, and we got to November as we're writing it on the calendar, and sure enough, the Sunday before Election Day, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. And we're
Mm,
like, come on,
wow.
God. God be
Can't get no better than that.
knowing
Yeah.
exactly what he's doing. So
Hmm.
I definitely would commend that to anyone who hasn't considered it in the past. And it just helps you to get a rhythm and get a good rhythm. So I appreciate you
Yeah.
for sharing that. Let's talk about DC a little bit more. What would you say is
Hmm.
some of the worldview challenges you have as a pastor in
Yeah.
DC, pastoring folks in that type of environment or community?
So I wouldn't say it's a challenge. It's just a truth that the DMV is a highly educated, politically savvy, and a not easily impressed area.
Yeah.
And so when it comes down to it, your preaching must be thoughtful. It must be applicable.
Mm.
It must who is it that says touch heaven and touch hearts at the same time. I don't know who I'm stealing that from, but I
Mm.
know I heard it from somewhere. Um, and so um, and so when it comes down to it, um, I would say this: that preachers come from all over the country, um, to DC, and everything that works everywhere
Don't work in
may
DC.
not work in the DMV.
Mm.
And it's just a different audience. It's just a different audience that's looking for something slightly different,
Mm.
in their preaching. We love celebration, but don't come to the DMV with your hoop, if it didn't meet me
Mm.
at my intellect.
Mm.
it's necessary. It's necessary. It must meet me in my intellect. It must be applicable and practical. And then if you give me a good holler, cool. But you really could have kept it at home, honestly, if it met those other aspects of what I need when I came to church.
Yeah.
The DMV is less churchy than other areas, I would say. Particularly in the younger generations, by noon, your young adults are at brunch, and there are other attractions that draw people even on Sundays in the DMV. Whereas, say for instance, in the South, people go to church, and in the South, folks will prioritize church before even football, right? Like
Yeah.
we're gonna watch a football game, but church comes first, probably in the South. Less so in the DMV. Not to a degree that it's ridiculous, but yeah, it's slightly less so in the DMV.
Well, when you got the Commanders there, I understand that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, mostly because our football team hasn't been good in like 30 years, but
So let me ask you this. I'm coming to your
I'll take that hit.
I'm coming to your church on Sunday morning and want to experience the worship experience. Am I getting some of the DC experience there? Am I getting some Sundays? Is there a vamp that may go into some go-go or something that might be local culturally?
Absolutely, and the music culture is different here. So live instrumentation is vital to an experience because that's just DC culture. Very good friend of mine, Pastor Tony Lee, Community of Hope AME Church. Their whole setup, their whole praise and worship setup is go-go. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with go-go, that's another reason why you should love DC. It's a genre of music that is native to DC, heavy percussion, and yeah, Reverend Lee's band is ridiculous. It's sick.
They're so dope.
So yes, there are some of those. There are some of those elements that, we don't do it as well as Community of Hope, but yeah, we love to create environments, worship environments that are unique to the DC experience. We don't excel in it like they do.
So let me ask you this in closing. You're talking to a younger pastor who is starting a new church or coming in as a pastor of a new church. What are the things that you would commend to them in their first 90 days from a leadership perspective?
First 90 days. Oh man, that's a whole podcast. That's a whole episode.
Right.
Your first 90 days, you are learning their culture. And what happens is young pastors, myself included, come into churches and church environments, and we think we got all the answers. And I just want you to know, young pastor, you don't even know the questions.
Yes, sir.
And the people who are there are going to tell you what the questions are so that you can modify whatever you think the answers are so that you can lead these people well. Taking a church is like a marriage, and marriage happens successfully when the values of one person and the values of the other merge and become as one.
Yeah.
I need to know what your values are in order to serve you well as your husband. I say to my wife, in order to serve my wife well, I got to know what her values are. And pastors, in order to serve the church well, we can't just bring our values into an existing church. I have to identify and understand what their values are and find, and the best thing you can do in your first year as a pastor is find the intersection between your values and their values and get victories at that intersection.
That's good.
Let them see you do what they love doing in an exceptional manner. And then you'll be able to play with the other stuff. But sometimes we come in messing with stuff that we shouldn't mess with yet. And the truth is, that's true even if you're planting a church. Church planners be like, well, I can't transition to church because I don't have enough patience to transition, people's culture. When I went into my church, I only had one culture to transition. If you plant a church, you got 7 people coming from 7 different churches. You have 7 cultures to transition.
Much harder. Yeah.
7 lists of expectations, and this is what church is, and this is what we did at my last church, and this is what you got to find out all of that, even as a church planter. And so, to me, I think it takes as much, maybe even more patience to plant a church if you know what you're doing. And so, yeah. I think it was E.K. Bailey said, he modified the scripture. He said, there's a way that seems right to a young preacher, and the end thereof is to get put out.
Listen, it's real, man. That's real, especially in Black church culture, for sure. Wow, that's good,
Absolutely. You got to be careful. You got to love the people by knowing what they value, and then finding the intersections to what you value, and then living there for the first year or two, and getting and that allows you to build the leadership capital to take risks and do things outside of that box.
That's good, man. You're right. This is definitely a whole episode. Leadership is one of my sweet spots, and I'd love to have you back to talk about leadership and church leadership, Black church leadership. That would be great. But this has been an amazing conversation, man. I appreciate you for joining me on the podcast, talking about your call, about your craft, and then the content and the context of your preaching. I might get back to DC one day, try some of that mambo sauce, man. If I do, I'll look you up. I might even do some go-go with you too, yes, man.
Hit me up, because I know the places to take you. I'll make sure you get the right stuff.
Listen,
man.
You know the spots, brother. You know the spots. Well, listen, I appreciate you all.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you all for joining us for this episode of the Preaching While Black podcast, where we focus on the call, the craft, and the content of the Black preaching tradition. We also appreciate Dr. Bobby Manning for joining us for this episode. Such a rich conversation. So many nuggets to draw from that. Hoping it helped you all. We're going to definitely drop that link to his resource in our comments and also in our description for the show, so you all can see that. And we're going to see you guys next go round on the Preaching While Black podcast. Grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to the Preaching While Black podcast. For more helpful content and resources, connect with us online at preachingwhileblack.com.